Hi, I'm Hannah Rozenblat from the Jerusalem Post. I am here today with Ittay Flescher. Ittay is an educator, journalist, and peacebuilder who is originally from Australia and moved to Israel in 2018. Currently, he is the education director of the interfaith youth movement, Kids for Peace Jerusalem, and his book, The Holy and the Broken, A Cry for Israeli-Palestinian Peace from a Land That Must Be Shared, was released this year by HarperCollins. Ittay is joining us today to discuss peace building during times of war. Ittay, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So, to start, I want to ask about your book because it's been out for a few months now and has garnered a lot of reactions and reviews, some of which have implied that peace building right now is naive. So, could you tell us a little bit about the reactions to your book?
Sure. So, writing a book is it's like bearing your soul. When you put a lot of stories in there that are very intimate and that are very personal. And in the book, I write not just about the successes of peace building, but also the many failures of peace building. And I think that's what makes a good book is about being vulnerable. About I've devoted my whole life to peace building. And so, yeah, some of the reactions call me naive and delusional and a dreamer. And I can understand why many Israelis and Palestinians who read the book would say that, because you look at the current situation and people say, "Why are you writing such a hopeful book?" I don't have any hope. All I have is despair. And so I very much understand where those criticisms are coming from. But I'd also say I'm also getting a lot of responses of people who are in no way politically aligned with me, and they're saying you put in a lot of the things that I say or think as well. And I did that on purpose because I think it's very easy to write a book where you only have one side of the argument, and I clearly do have a view, which I'll talk about later in the interview. But I also think it's really important to state all the views that I disagree with, not in a way to belittle or dismiss them, but in a way to say there's a reason those views exist and I'm going to respond to them, but I'm also going to tell you why they exist as well. And I think I've read many books on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and very few of them, very few Palestinian books try to give the Israeli argument sympathetically, or very few Israeli books give the Palestinian argument sympathetically. And I try to do both because I think as a dialogue facilitator, before I talk about solutions, which I do in the second half of the book, I think it's very important to outline the history and the narrative of the problem, because ultimately the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's not about a resource. It's not about like oil or water or, one specific item. Ultimately, it's about a story. It's about a story about who lives in this land, who belongs here. And I think it's important to tell those stories. And that generates a lot of reactions, both positive and negatively, because the way I tell the story of how we got to October 7th is perhaps different to the way many other books tell that story, because I try and tell the story through multiple perspectives.
Right. And the book was written after October 7th.
Yes.
And you've been involved in grassroots peace building efforts in Israel for many years now, both before and after. So, have you seen a shift in local peace movements after October 7th?
Yeah, so just a little bit about my background. I grew up, I was born in Israel. I grew up in Australia. I was a high school teacher there for 15 years, facilitating interfaith dialogue, teaching Hebrew, Shoah, Tanakh, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, adult education with Melton. And then I moved to Jerusalem 7 years ago, and I've been working with Seeds of Peace, which is an international peace-building organization. And specifically, I run a program called Kids for Peace Jerusalem. And throughout those years, we've had many ups and downs, but I think especially since October 7th, there's been a lot of shock and grief and loss and despair, because, we live here in the same way that everyone else lives here, and we see the same news. And even though we are working in a joint environment, we feel the same pain that everyone else feels. And and I'd also say specifically with the peacebuilding community, there were many people in the peacebuilding community that were killed on October 7th, probably most notably Vivian Silva from Women Wage Peace and Chaim Katzman and Nama Levy, who was a member of Hands of Peace, which is a very similar organization to Seeds of Peace, run joint summer camps. And then also in Gaza, we had Ayat Khadura. She was a member of Zimam. She was killed in Beit Lachia with three of her siblings. And she was, at the time working on a documentary about life in Gaza. And so I think the peacebuilding community is still in shock by October 7th and the devastation of Gaza. And for some people, I'd say a small amount of people, that turned them away from peacebuilding. But I'd say most of the people in the peacebuilding community are still in that community because they feel our work is more important than ever now.
Right. And did you see challenges in the peace-building community after October 7th? Is there anything specific that was challenging or problematic in returning to work?
So safety is an issue. I live in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is always a tense place. There's always things going on here. And, I remember after October 7th, probably for about a month, no one wanted to leave the house. It was sort of like COVID again, because people didn't know what was going to happen here. There's always tensions around Al-Aqsa as well. So I think safety was our concern. We paused programs for several months after October 7th, and then we resumed in May of 2024, and then we've been running a program ever since. But I think, safety is definitely a challenge, and also doing what we do with integrity and not leaving out the elephant in the room when we have the dialogues that we do.
Right. So I think this is on two levels because there are the greater peace-building movements and the people involved in them. And I also want to hear more specifically your work at Kids for Peace and what challenges you might have faced there when you returned to it.
So we deal with Kids for Peace is a peace building program for children. The participants are aged 12 to 16, and then we have Mulshidin or Madrichim who are 16 to 18 who are former participants themselves. So we run bi-weekly meetings in Jerusalem in Hebrew and Arabic. And the purpose of Kids for Peace is not to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's not a political program. We are actually an interfaith program, and so most of our program and our dialogue is about religion, culture, tradition, food, festivals, those sorts of things. And it's an opportunity for the children to share what they have in common. So I remember one of the first activities we did after October 7th, where we knew that obviously the kids had seen, immense amounts of violence on Instagram and TikTok and that sort of thing. And we didn't want it to be a traumatizing session of, talking about all the horrible things I've seen. So we've did the first program about your vision for Jerusalem. So we did like a values auction. We put up all these values on a board, and they were security, freedom of religion, equality, justice, good food, good parks, sports venues. And we gave each group like an amount of like fake money, and then they had to bid for what they want to see in Jerusalem. And the idea of the program was each had to say, during this war, during this time where there's decreased safety and a lot of concern and worry for our families and friends both in Gaza and in Israel and in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, what's the vision of what we want to see here? What's most important for us in Jerusalem? And I think doing that activity, enabling the kids to talk about the future, was a lot more nourishing than talking about the past or what has been. And so I feel like a lot of our programs, perhaps even more so since the war, talk about the future.
There are a lot of peace organizations that are working here right now, but are they having any sort of actual effect? Are they making any real change, do you think?
Um, I'd say yes and no. I think on a small scale and to the people involved in them, yes, they're making an impact, but on a larger scale, no. On a larger scale, there's more violence and there's less support for, let's say, a two-state solution than there's ever been in history. And so, yeah, there's a question is, have these peace building organizations failed when there's, support for reconciliation, dialogue seems to be lesser than ever. And I think I'd respond to that in two ways. One is that the way you measure support for peace is, it's a very fuzzy science, because you could say maybe there's less support for a two-state solution, in Israel right now, but then there's also a higher support for a regional agreement, a normalization with Saudi Arabia. Um, there's there's less support for Hamas now among Palestinians, but you don't know if that's necessarily because of a desire for peace or because of a sense of what Hamas did to Palestinians, especially in Gaza. But I would say that the peace building organizations didn't fail because our message is wrong. I think we failed because we were too small. I think if you look at the amount of Israelis and Palestinians that participate in some sort of dialogue group or joint Israeli-Palestinian sports club or a joint cooking group or a joint book club or a writers group or anything like that, like it's probably less than 1%. So yeah, I think of other social change movements that have been successful, let's say like LGBT rights or the feminist movement. The numbers of people that support those movements in societies where they're successful are 50, 60, 70%. And so, we are in a situation where I don't think our idea is wrong. I just think we haven't explained our idea well, and we haven't reached out to a very large number of people. And I think people that have different ideas from our ideas are much more effective at selling those ideas than we are. And part of the reason why I wrote this book is because I think there, in addition to this being a war about human life, it's also a war about ideas. And I think the peace building community needs to do better at putting its voice and its vision out there. And yes, we're going to be called naive and delusional and crazy, and you're John Lennon and you're a dreamer, and I get that all the time. But people that believe in the alternative ideas, maybe they believe in Mashiach or jihad, or they believe in these other sort of like religiously based ideas that maybe don't have a place for the other in this land. I think that they're not shy about expressing their ideas and putting them on the internet and saying them in public forums. And I think we need to do the same with the ideas of peace and coexistence and forgiveness and humanization. We need to put those ideas on the table in a clear and logical way, and that's what I've tried to do in this book. And I hope that more people will see that that's a path that's possible, and that peace is a risk worth taking.
Right. So it's just necessary to bring more people in, have strength in
Yeah,
numbers.
absolutely.
Hmm. And what strengths of the peace movement do you feel were revealed by the war and by peace building efforts after the war?
So, Seeds of Peace is part of ALMEP, the Alliance for Middle East Peace, and there's over 160 organizations that are part of ALMEP. I mean, just last month I was at an iftar meal near the Dead Sea run by the Children of Abraham organization, where 600 Israelis and Palestinians came together
Wow.
to have an iftar meal. And you would look at that and think that's impossible. Like, how is that happening? How there's still summer camps happening? There's still there's still a joint memorial happening for victims of war that will happen next month. So I think a lot of peace building organizations are still going, and I think I think there's a myth in Israeli society that people who believed in peace on October 7th stopped believing in peace after October 7th. And while there are some cases like that, from what I know, I would say people that had right wing views before October 7th probably have more right wing views now, and people that believed in peace before October 7th believe in peace even more now. And I don't think October 7th shifted many people's politics or shifted many people's religious or social views. I think what it did was it made people in certain camps believe their views even more. So if you have a right wing or conservative view, you believe that um, the war and defeating Hamas and being resolute and not compromising on any issue is more essential than ever for Israeli security. And if you believe in peace building, then you believe that dialogue and diplomacy and multinational opportunities for peace, like the Egyptian proposal to end the war in Gaza and a hostage deal, and all of those sorts of things are more essential than ever. And so I think that's probably my observation of what happened to the peace building communities. People just leaned into it even more, thinking now is the time to resist dehumanization, to resist simplistic black and white solutions or solutions that call for, all the Jews to go back to Europe or all the Palestinians to go to Egypt or those sorts of things, and to affirm that this is a land that must be shared. It's a home for between the river and the sea. Today live some 7.5 million Jews, about 7 million Arabs, with a range of different citizenship statuses, and accepting that we both live in this land, and if we can't find a way to share it, then this land will just be graveyards. It will just be mourning tents and shiver homes, and we don't want any more of that. We don't want any more suffering. We don't want any more mothers burying their children. The natural course of the world is that children should bury their parents and not the other way around, and that's just happened too many times for us to think this is something we can keep doing.
Right. So you're saying that even though there are some people who might have left, there's still enough of a base for peace building movements here in Israel, and also people joining for the first time because
Yep.
they realize that there must be another way.
Yeah. When we were recruiting for Kids for Peace, we had over 30 kids that joined for the first time, had never come to a peace building organization, and joined us this year for our programs in January, and that's just in Jerusalem. But I know of many other programs where kids are joining, because they're saying, I want to know what's the alternative, because when we look around us, we don't see that. We don't see it in our media. We don't see it not in our social media, definitely. And hope is an incredibly valuable commodity that no one can see. Sort of like belief as well. Like belief or faith or religion, these are things you can't make a statue of, or you can't sort of quantify. But when you have a certain belief or a faith or a hope, then it drives all of your behaviors to do, to fight or to resist or to do whatever you feel is necessary as a result of that belief. And I think if you can, our organization is called Seeds of Peace. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to plant a seed of maybe peace is possible. And if peace is possible, what are the things you would do today that you wouldn't do if you didn't think peace was possible? So I can say, like me as an Israeli Jew, I'm learning Arabic at the moment. Why am I learning Arabic? Because I think that my speaking Arabic and more Israeli Jews speaking Arabic is more likely to result in a peaceful future. But if I didn't think peace was possible, maybe I wouldn't learn Arabic. Maybe I'd say that's a waste of time. And it's the same for a Palestinian that maybe is or an Arab citizen of Israel who is like, you know what, I want to go to a Pesach Seder. I want to I'm going to call up my Jewish friend on Hanukkah and say, tell me a bit more about that. Or I'm going to go to a hostage protest, or I'm going to do anything that engages with the Jewish or Israeli narrative. I'm going to speak out against violence against Jews in Israel, those sorts of things. They do that because they believe peace is possible, and they're trying to build a bridge, and they're trying to communicate that their religion and their culture believes that peace is possible. And I think peace is built by these thousands of small actions. And I know in Kids for Peace, we take a lot of inspiration from Northern Ireland. So in 2019, we took 12 of our kids to Belfast. And Belfast, while not the same as our conflict at all, did suffer in the 1970s during the Troubles, regular bombings of pubs and police stations, and many children killed. And they also engaged in grassroots peacebuilding through the International Fund for Ireland. And then, 20 years later, again, there's not peace in Northern Ireland. There's still tensions there, but far, far less than there was 20 or 30 years ago, because they decided to create a power sharing government, and they decided to um, I guess technically work out a way that they could live together despite their very, very significant disagreements about the future of whether Northern Ireland would be part of the Republic or part of the UK. And so I think I think that gives me hope that we're not the first people in the world to have a major dispute about our historic narrative about who this land belongs to. And if it can be solved in Northern Ireland, and there's many other places that have had wars and conflicts from Bosnia Herzegovina to Rwanda to South Africa to El Salvador. I go through many of these examples in the book, and I look at what can we learn from other places that have suffered great violence to how to build peace. And I think while no two situations are the same, within each case that I look at in the book, there's something that I can learn. And if I had to summarize them all in sort of one word, it would be to resist dehumanization. Because for me, dehumanization is the greatest obstacle to peace. When you look as an Israeli at a family that was killed in Gaza with children, and you see those images, and your first response, instead of crying and feeling pain, is but
Right.
that's dehumanization. And if a Palestinian or anyone that doesn't live here looks at October 7th and sees what happens at Kibbutz Nir Oz and Be'eri, and looks at the Nova Festival and says, but the occupation, but, that's dehumanization. So the first step has to be to not rationalize violence, to not rationalize atrocities, to not rationalize the taking of innocent life. That doesn't mean that I'm a pacifist. I believe that both Israel and the Palestinians have a right to self-defense. I believe that armies are necessary. But I think what we've seen during this war is, a level of violence like beyond anything we've ever imagined or experienced or seen that's possible. And then the justifications for that violence lead into this cycle of dehumanization that is, it just breaks my heart when I see it. I just think, like, how can you look at that image or that idea and think that was okay, or give a reason for that? There's never a reason. There's certain things that you just don't do. They're wrong. They're immoral. And so I want to consistently hold that value, not just when those things happen to my people, but when they happen to the Palestinians and to my friends and colleagues that work in this field as well. And I think by affirming the humanity of all people, I think that's the first step to building hope that another way is possible.
Yeah, that is so important. And you mentioned the importance of hope and also how observing the conflicts in other regions gave you hope when you saw the way that they were either resolved or people were brought together for dialogue.
Mm.
And I wanted to ask, is there anything in particular that gave you the hope and strength to continue working in peace building here after October 7th and the devastation of the war? Is there something that you observed in Israel that gave you that hope?
I think for me, on the 1st of June, I went to this massive peace event at the Menorah Arena in Tel Aviv. And I remember it began with 12 people on stage who were all, they were Jewish and Arab and Palestinian, and all of them had lost loved ones during the war in various places. And one of them was even a hostage as well, and had been released, Liat Atzili. And I looked at them and I thought, you have every reason in the world to want revenge. You have every reason in the world to want to kill the people on the other side, given what you went through or what your family went through. And these 12 people each told their personal stories, and all of them, gave messages similar to the messages of the holy and the broken, which were against violence, against revenge, against dehumanization. And I looked at them, and thank God I haven't lost any loved ones in this war. And I thought, if you can lose the most valuable thing in your life, your own freedom as a hostage, or the life of your mother and father, like Maozinon lost, and you can then get up on a stage and in front of thousands of people and then talk about peace, then who am I to not believe in peace? Like I went through nothing what you went through, but you lost so much, and then you're still here advocating for that. To me, I find that very inspiring, and the more I speak to bereaved Israeli and Palestinian parents, some of whom are active in Kids for Peace as well, I derive a lot of inspiration from them, thinking, that these people are really role models for me, that they take this immense grief and loss and suffering that they've experienced, and then they turn that into movements for social change, so that no one should ever again experience the grief that they experienced.
Can you share with us a recent story from your own work that gave you hope?
Yeah, so since The Holy and the Broken has come out, I've received hundreds of emails and WhatsApps from people around the world, who have been, inspired by the message of the book, but have also shared a lot of personal stories about how they've been troubled in the past year due to rising anti-Semitism or dehumanization, or maybe they've lost their job because they had a certain political or social view, or a lot of people sadly have lost friendships of people they really, really cared about. And people are reading the book and they're asking me, what can I do to repair this friendship, or for me to be able to rejoin, let's say, an LGBT community that I was part of that I felt excluded of because I had a certain view about the war. And a lot of those people, I've talked them through a lot about language. There's certain words, Zionism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, anti-Semitism, that, you hear those words and people think those words mean something, and then the people using them actually mean something very different when they're using those words. So I unpack a lot of language. And then I also encourage people to lean into difficult conversations, to try and talk to people that they disagree with. And the advice I often give to people is, don't respond on with a WhatsApp or with an emoji or with a tweet or something. Invite the person for a meal. Like, if there's someone that you disagree with, say, let's go for a meal, let's go for a walk, let's talk it out. And there's something happens when you talk to someone face to face, that can't happen on social media. And I know a lot of people that have, since reading this book, have reached out to sometimes even their parents, that they haven't been in contact to for a long time, and they said, this book, helped me have hope that I can still be in community with people that I disagree with. And can we talk about language? Can we talk about what you mean when you say ABC? Can I tell you how that makes me feel? And there's a whole chapter in the book of how supporters of Israel and Palestine can talk to each other, where I go through a lot of those examples and the things we do in Kids for Peace that enable that to be possible. And I just feel really grateful that I've you know I think every relationship that you can save, especially if it's between a daughter and her mother, which has happened to me several times. I feel like it's such a gift to be able to have written something that's helping people, uh, repair broken families as a result of this war. And I know that there's many organizations that try to do this. I think For the Sake of Argument is also a great organization that publishes these guides on how to talk about this. And when you look at articles online, I know The Forward recently was talking about their most read articles over the past year. and their most read articles were articles about how to have conversations with people you disagree with after the war. And they're in the Jerusalem Post, and they're in many. And I think that's a real need that people have of how do we not. This war has already taken so many lives, but how do we not let it tear apart also our dearest friendships and work relationships and relationships with people that we love?
That's really beautiful. And that gives a lot of hope that people are able to have those difficult conversations. We've spoken a lot about people living in Israel, but what about people outside of Israel? What role can they play in promoting grassroots peace movements in Israel or other real solutions in the region?
Yeah, so I think for people not living in this region, there's probably three things you can do, and I actually list them on my website, ittay.au, and there's a link there saying, what can I do? So I think the first is education. I think a lot of people that have opinions about this are not well educated. And so I put on my website a whole list of books, resources, websites, podcasts. I'm a big fan of book clubs. I think there are many, very powerful humanizing books that you can read that will help you understand this place much better. Um, Podcasts, we're blessed to have so many fantastic podcasts where you can get personal stories of people that you would never meet, and people that you don't always think of, like what does a Haredi in Geula think about this war, or what does a Palestinian refugee in Jordan think about this war. Voices that you don't necessarily hear on podcasts. You can find them all in English, so I recommend a lot of podcasts to listen to. So that's the first thing, education. The next thing is, again, on my website, I have a lot of tools for dialogue on how to have difficult conversations, to the extent of even going through scripts of things that you can say, things that you can ask. And that's not just for conversations about this. It could be a conversation about democracy or about climate change or gun violence or any sort of political or social issue that you feel is dividing you at the moment. Then you can go to the website, and there's resources on that. And then the last is to support peace building movements. There's an immense amount of money that comes to this place every year, and a very small amount of it goes to peace building organizations. And while I know that there's always this tension of boycott something, if it's something you don't like, boycott. We want less of that in the world, so I boycott it. And I would say, instead of boycotting A, B, or C, invest in what you want to see more of. So if you want to see more health, invest in Magen David Adom. But if you want to see more peace building, then invest in peace organizations. I think that's also really important. And then doing all those three things, the education, the dialogue, and support, I think all together, those things give hope. And once you have hope that something is possible, the Jewish people, we're known for having hope in impossible things. I mean, we wouldn't be sitting in this room in Jerusalem today if someone didn't have hope that there would be a homeland for our people here today. And so I think just not losing hope is the most important thing I want people to take from this interview and from the book. And I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you so much for coming and talking to us about this. It was very interesting. Thank you.